Having tried to open the back door to the building to no avail, the frazzled university official goading them on, security guards rushed around the building to the other side that's open to the lawn and the riverbank. They showed up at the edge of the lawn, unsure whether to get on the stage in front of the audience. One of them started shouting with the crowd, before ordering them to stop.
Helter Skelter! Helter Skelter!
Woodlowski looked at them and beyond, at the river flowing behind the lawn, then threw his head back and closed his eyes, his fingers pulling the strings on autopilot. When he opened his eyes, he took in Beetle's hell at the opposite riverbank, as Harihara glared at him from the middle of swampy, muddy waters. But the mechanical demon shook violently, and steam rose up in odd places. He twitched as pieces began to fall away before he finally fell apart, split right down the middle. There in the core, on a high seat, was Harihara, very human and very cowardly, desperately trying to pull levers and throw switches, clinging to the power that he no longer had over Woodlowski, over any of them. He saw Beata poke her head up from beneath the surface of the swamp. She tried to swim forward, rising and falling, simply trying to reach the edge where the shattered remains of the maze stood. Harihara crumbled about as it struggled to move, yet he managed to keep Beata from reaching the riverbank. A warm, familiar hand pressed on Woodlowski's shoulder. It was there and gone at the moment Woodlowski looked over his shoulder, but as he looked back, he saw him. Woodlowski saw that Drug had escaped from his cell and was running forward, jumping over the cavernous crack that separated them from the swamp. Together, they leaped forward, diving into the swamp, and swam toward Beata to help her reach the edge of the swamp while keeping Harihara away. Woodlowski pulled himself out of the swamp onto the bank, knelt down and reached out, no longer afraid. He felt Drug's hand on his back, supporting him. Their hands skimmed the surface, but they stretched out, reaching for Beata until they finally wrapped their hands around her wrist, until she was safely in their grip. They rocked back on their feet, hauling her forward and out of the swamp. Drug grinned at Woodlowski and Beata as they walked over to a small raft and sat down on it, rowing towards the large barge that floated within Beetle's heaven, where a large crowd surrounded the raft, roaring and cheering, helping them aboard. On the barge, Woodlowski, Drug, and Beata saw a reunion of their favorite musicians, led by all the Beatles, along with many fifth ones. Woodlowski looked outside to the river and saw that Harihara and Yama, the deity of death, started chasing the raft and, after a few minutes, finally reached the barge. Indeed, the very next moment they rushed into the club trying to fetch Drug back to the Beatles' hell and to separate Woodlowski and Beata. Harihara approached Woodlowski with a frown and murmured to him,
"Your curse stays. You will not reunite with Her Majesty until the Beatles reunite."
But what happens here is the reunion of the Beatles in the true sense. In my mind, it doesn't matter to the immortal music if the musicians are alive or not. So what else do you even mean by the reunion?
Do you think they are immortal?
In fact, I think they are immortal. Wait a second. Do you mean their true reunion is going to be in the future when everyone is on the other side? I don't even want to think about it. No true Beatle fan ever allows himself to think about it in this atrociously evil way.
Meanwhile, Yama tried to get Drug into the custody of himself and his dogs to take him back to the Beatles' hell. But, even bewildered, Woodlowski started to fight with both Yama and Harihara in front of the astonished Beatles. Yama and Harihara looked shocked by Woodlowski's sudden bravery and stepped back from him. Both Harihara and Yama seemed to be strangely subdued in the presence of the Beatles. Was it that they knew that the Beatles respected the Hindu religion, or were they in awe of them anyway as creatures of the Beatles' heaven and hell? Woodlowski used the pause to start explaining to the Beatles that Drug needed to be transferred to the Beatles' heaven for all his devotion, courage, and help to try to save Her Majesty. John argued with the side of Harihara, representing Shiva. George was in discussion with the other side of Harihara, which was Krishna. Paul talked with Yama, while Ringo played with the four-eyed dogs. the austere but fair one Yama, finally succumbing to the pressure and having exchanged some private words with Harihara, asked,
Windlowski, what would you sacrifice if I release Drooped from hell into the Beatles' heaven? What if we curse you to immortality in exchange for his transfer? You will become the eternal Beatles fan. Are you ready?
How is immortality a bad thing? Anyway, sure I'm ready for anything to rescue my friend.
Wydlowski found himself sailing for years and decades in his boat, which looked like a rusty and shabby yellow submarine, along the rivers approaching the delta of the Beatles' heaven and hell, unable to approach any shore.